Greetings to all. I'm Sejal Khanna, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome you all here on behalf of the English Department Association of Janki Devi Memorial College. I invite Dr. Sanjukta Naskar, the association in charge of English Department, to formally welcome the guest and address the gathering.
Hello, everybody. I'm Sanjukta Naskar. It's a fantastic session that we are expecting here. I welcome Professor Ketkar to the English Department of Janki Devi Memorial College, and thanks to Antara for having organized this. She's the coordinator for this session, and I'm really hoping that the students are going to immensely benefit from this session. Over to you, Sejal.
Thank you, ma'am. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I consider it a privilege to welcome our speaker for today, Dr. Sachin Ketkar, a bilingual writer, translator, and researcher known for the English writings like Skin and Spam and Other Encounters. Along with being an English writer and translator for several languages like Gujarati, Marathi, Hindi, Urdu, Malayalam, and Telugu, he is currently working as a professor of English, Faculty of Arts, the Maharaja Sayajirao University of Baroda, Vadodara, and is working on a critical history of Marathi literature. We are extremely delighted and honored to have you with us, sir. The floor is all yours.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. I would like to begin by thanking Dr. Antara and Dr. Naskar for having me here. It's a pleasure to be with the Janki Devi Memorial College. And one of the reasons that I feel privileged to talk about Namdeo Dhasal is one generation, entire generation of poets writing in Marathi like me have grown up being inspired by the extraordinary talent and creativity that Namdeo Dhasal brought to Marathi language. And in my own personal opinion, probably he's one of the greatest poets after independence in India. So it's a privilege to talk about him. So I want to thank the organizers of this event for having me here and share my views. Just minor correction regarding introduction given to me. I don't translate from multiple languages or into. It's only that some of my works have gone into multiple languages like Telugu and Malayalam and Kannada. So this is just a minor thing. What I want to do today is I would like to first of all situate Namdeo Dhasal in a larger historical context from which the poems that some of you who are the students of the department are looking at, the larger social historical context, and look at some of his stylistic features, themes, and images which are distinctive in his works. So that is what I plan to do. So I would like to begin by sharing my screen. I wonder if my screen is visible.
Yes, sir.
It is.
Right. Yeah, so Namdeo Dhasal being a Marathi poet, the context of Marathi literature and the cultural and social history of Western region, especially Maharashtra, is one of the most important context to situate his work. So I will be talking about that. And also historically try to place him in the period to which he belonged, and also talk about some of the themes in his work, and that will help you to the students who are studying his works to analyze some poems that you are looking at. Namely, I think one is Mandakini Patil, Mala Abhipret Ek Collage. That is one poem from his very famous first collection called Golpitha. And second is Hunger. Again, it's from his later work, probably Tuji Iyatta Kainchi. So these are two poems that you're looking at, but I will give a kind of slightly broader context, and then also look at the space from which his poetry comes from, so that the poems themselves are kind of spaces which in many ways have parallels to the space from which he comes from. So that is what I intend to do here in today's presentation. So this is just a brief overview of his life and works. Namdeo Dhasal, 1949 to 2014, is not just a poet, but intellectual who has written novel as well as many journalistic columns, and also a lot of prose apart from his poetry. Was also a political leader and an activist in Maharashtra. He is as fascinating and extremely controversial. To sum up the well-recounted tale, he was born in Dalit, which literally means downtrodden, used as a preferred self-description by politically aware members of former untouchable caste. And that is something that is very important for us to understand what we understand by the term Dalit. And one of the things about this term Dalit is that it's a contested idea even within Maharashtra. Well, who is a Dalit after all? And when we look at the broader Pan-Asian context or South Asian context or Indian context, we find that the term becomes extremely ambivalent and ambiguous. Means some of the writers in Gujarat may not be called Dalits in strict sense of the term in Maharashtra, for example. So it's a problematic term, but I will use it in its narrower sense. And this tension between the narrower sense of the term Dalit and the broader sense of the term Dalit as a downtrodden or people who are oppressed under feet, trampled upon. So this broader meaning of the word and a very narrow specific meaning of the word becomes a kind of tension that has defined Dalit politics almost in Maharashtra, something that I will just touch upon in the course of my discussion. He belonged to the community of Mahars, one of the militant Dalit communities in Maharashtra, very aware, politically aware, thanks to the phenomenal work by Dr. Ambedkar, in a small village of Pur Kanesar near Pune on February 15, 1949. So by the time Dr. Ambedkar passed away in 1956 after the massive conversion of most of the Mahars into Buddhism in 1956. So Dhasal would be around 7 years of age probably, and his father had converted to Buddhism with Dr. Ambedkar. So that is one very important aspect of his life that we have to keep in mind. He grew up in what is called Dhorcha. Dhor is actually caste of an untouchable community, traditionally forced into the profession of removing animal carcasses. Near the infamous lead-right area of Kamathipura in Mumbai. And this becomes a very important context and a space for his poetry. His father migrated to Mumbai and worked as an assistant to a local butcher, and Namdeo worked as a taxi driver. He grew up among the Dalits, migrant workers, sex workers, pimps, their customers, lepers, smugglers, drug peddlers, and petty criminals of all sorts. And this was his upbringing, and he did not have much of formal education, but he was brilliantly self-educated, means he had read almost entire Marathi literature and whatever he could lay his hands on. So though his formal education was fairly limited, he was widely read in Marathi literature and world literature, something that we have to keep in mind. He brought out a collection titled Gol Pitha in 1972, named after a neighboring place in Kamathipura called Gol Pitha. Gol means round structure, and Pitha is the country liquor shop, desi liquor. So Gol Pitha was a place for brewing country liquor. When he was barely 23 in the year 1972, and which can be considered as one of the most important collection of poetry in the post-independence era. And it created a kind of massive what should I say, uproar and an earthquake in Marathi literary world, because of not just extremely politically aggressive language, but also very explicit sexuality and irreverence to the traditional pieties associated with literature. So that created a storm in Marathi world. But before he brought out his collection Golpita, he had been regularly publishing his poems in periodicals like Satya Katha, which is supposed to be the establishment magazine. And later on, the Little Magazine movement in Marathi would attack Satya Katha for its elite status and for its pro-establishment, if you want to say, use that word, that kind of politics that it was allegedly having. Later, he was expelled. He founded an organization inspired by the Black Panther movement called Dalit Panther, along with Raja Dhale, Zavi Pawar, and many others. I will talk about that as we go along. And he was expelled on the charge of being close to affiliated to Marxists. And Marxism and Ambedkarism had a strange ideological tension in Maharashtra, because most of the left leaders in those days, and probably even today, are largely Brahmins and upper caste. And Marxism was seen as one of the ways of perpetuating hegemony, caste hegemony, by underplaying the question of caste and considering it as just as a kind of subset of class. So class politics was a central idea in Marxism, while Dalits wanted to underscore the question of caste. And caste was a different kind of social formation and not exactly class as the left would have it. And the tension between the Dalit movement and Marxism goes back to 1935 essay by Dr. Ambedkar, Buddha Kiwa Marx, Buddha or Marx. And to the shock of his leftist admirers, he then joined Shiv Sena informally in the late 1990s. So that political career was extremely controversial. He was conferred Padma Shri in 1999, and Sahitya Academy conferred lifetime achievement to Dhasal in 2004, and he died on 15th January 2014 after battling cancer. His collected poems have been recently published. His main collections are Golpita 72, Murkha Mataryaने Dongar Halaville, that is the stupid old man shook up the mountain in 1975. Priyadarshini, that is a long ode-like poem devoted to Indira Gandhi in 1976 during the emergency. The poem was written at that time. Tuhi Itcha Kainchi was in 1981, Kher in 1983, Gandu Bagicha in 1986. या सत्तेत जीव रमत नाही 1995, मी मारले सूर्याच्या रथेचे 7 घोडे 2005, गुलाबी आयाळीचा घोडा, तुझे बोट धरून चालू आहे मी, आणि निर्वाणी अगोदरची पीडा in 2010. He has also written fiction called Hadki Halavdala, Negative Space, उजेडाची काळी दुनिया, and non-fictional prose like Ambedkari Chalwal आणि Socialist, where he tries to give his side of the narrative of his being expelled from the Dalit Panther party. Buddha Dharma, Kahi Shesh Prashna, Andhale Shatak, which is a collection of his newspaper columns, and Sarva Kahi Samishti Sati 2003. The Dalit movement in Maharashtra goes back to the movement called Satyashodhak Chalwal, started in mid-19th century by a great visionary Jyotirao Phule, 1827 to 1990. And it was a very sharp critique of internal colonialism of the Varna Jati caste system. And it was emphasizing reform of every type. And it was one of the first schools for the girls started by Indians, were by Jyotiba Phule and his wife Savitribai Phule very early in the first half of 19th century. And the whole movement took several directions. By the time you came to 1920, where another very firebrand movement, a revolutionary movement, was spearheaded by Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, who returned from Britain and America after his studies. And he started his own periodicals, and he started activism and one of the earliest activism that he started was entry into a temple called Kalaram Mandir, and also burning of Manu Smriti. These were the early actions. Dr. Ambedkar was extremely harsh critique of Gandhian freedom struggle and Gandhian ideology, as they refused to consider caste oppression as central to the idea of freedom itself. Means you cannot conceive of freedom without freedom from internal oppression. So this was the background, and both these movements use the traditional folk theater or tamasha or jalsas for their own, to propagate their ideology. Means there is something called Satya Shodhak Jalsa that was started by the Satya Shodhak movement of Phule, and Ambedkarite Jalsa. And these were the use of traditional tamasha form. Tamasha had turned into a kind of erotic double innuendo entertainment, which was taken up by these two movements for didactic as well as political purposes. After playing a lead role in formation of constitution, Ambedkar converted to Buddhism with his lack of his follower, mostly the Mahars, the community to which Namdeo Dhasal is part of, before his demise. And this movement is called Dhammachakra Parivartan. So Namdeo Dhasal and the Dalit Panther movement emerges in the aftermath of this demise of Dr. Ambedkar. Before his death, he had conceptualized a new political party called the Republican Party of India. And Dalit politics, like probably all the politics in India, was constantly undermined by internal factionalism. And there were several attempts to reconcile internal rivalries, and question of who should lead the Dalit politics after Dr. Ambedkar's demise became a burning issue. So the party split in 1959. And this split again happened because one side accused the other of being close to communist and a leftist. So you can see that there is a pattern developing over here. And this ideological fault line between Marxist ideology and Ambedkarite leadership would play a critical role in various Dalit movements after the formation of Maharashtra in 1960. So modern Maharashtra emerges after 1960. In 1956, Maharashtra was a kind of two-state, two-language state, with Gujarat and Maharashtra sharing Bombay as their capital. So the Dalit literary movement of the 60s, which is very different from its precursor, Dalit literature, means substantial amount of literature was produced by two movements, that is Satya Shodhak movement and Ambedkarite movement. But how is this movement different from that? Is that it was here that they resolved to come up with a category of Dalit literature, and that the civil rights movements or even the Black Panther movements was an influence, a global influence on this movement. And some of the most important Marathi writers like Raja Dhale, Namdeo Dhasal, Arjun Dangle, Prahlad Chendwankar were part of it. And it was a kind of fallout with disillusionment with the Republican Party. And that is an important context that has to be borne in mind, because Dalit politics was given to infightings before and when the serious oppression incidents of oppression and exploitation came to forefront, especially in the village Bauda in 1972 and humiliation of Dalit women in village of Marathwada, and a blinding of Gawai brothers in Dhakli village. So all, as well as the report given by Elia Perumal committee report in the parliament, which highlighted that after independence, the atrocities against the Dalits was not decreasing as was expected, but was in fact increasing. And all this provided a trigger for this movement called the Dalit Panther movement. And it was extremely well-organized movement in an age where even landline phones were a rarity, probably, or did not exist. Thousands of people used to gather in response to any event of atrocity. And these thousands of people were brought together by Dalit Panthers. So, and they used to fight for justice. So, in even when we can't even imagine this kind of movement today, even with highly developed means of communication. That's what used to happen. But it was disbanded later by Raja Dhale, who was an important writer and activist. And he accused Dhasal of being communist. And one of the reasons was that the Dalit Panther manifesto, which you may find online very easily, was accused of being a communist manifesto, in the sense that Dhasal and Sunil Dighe, who was himself associated with Naxal movement, tried to define Dalit broadly, in the sense of everybody who is oppressed in terms of caste, in terms of class, in terms of gender, in terms of occupation, rural, urban divide, what have you. So this broad definition of the term Dalit did not, I think, was not very compatible with more narrower and sharper definitions of Dalit as previous untouchable castes. So these two definitions were always in tension. And then after it was disbanded, there were other writers like Arjun Kamble, Ramdas Athawale, who is one of the political leaders in Maharashtra today. Vaman Nimbalkar, among others, they decided to revive the party, called it Bharatiya Dalit Panther. And Raja Dhale called an organization Mass Movement with Zavi Pawar. And Zavi Pawar has recently come up with a book which gives a history of Dalit Panther movement, which some of you may want to read up. And there were several other organizations like Namdeo Dhasal's own Dalit Panthers, Raja Dhale's mass movement, Ramdas Athawale's, and so on, Dalit Mukti Sena, and so on. So this is the historical backdrop to Namdeo Dhasal's life as an activist. And he was always insisting that his life as an activist and his life as a writer were not separate life. They were not, they were both intertwined, and you couldn't separate one from the other. So that's the position he took. Another important trigger in the background was the 1972 with the plans of massive celebrations of Silver Jubilee of Indian independence. There were discussions in Parliament regarding disrespect of the national flag and playing the national anthem after screening of films, wherein Prime Minister Indira Gandhi responded to take strict action, including fine and arrest of those who respected the flag. So in response to these developments and the rising reports of atrocities, Dhale wrote a provocative article called Kala Swatantra Din, that is Black Independence Day, where he would say that the fine levied on humiliating a Dalit woman was far less compared to people who the fine imposed by for insulting the flag, to show disrespect of flag. And they carried out many activities like burning a copy of Bhagavad Gita and Gandhi's writing. And his activism spread. And one of the triggers was this BDD Chol re-elections, where Shiv Sena was a major stakeholder, and there was a violent backlash from Shiv Sena on towards Dalit Panther, and the whole thing turned very violent. And the Congress lost its place to communist Rosa Deshpande. However, when Indira Gandhi declared emergency, both Shiv Sena as well as Dalit Panther and Namdeo Dhasal gave into her politics. Dhasal went on to write a long poem praising her, and Panther split into several factions over ideological and interpersonal relations. However, the whole movement was revived in 77 with the demand for changing the name of Marathwada University into Dr. Bhimrao Ambedkar Marathwada University. And this movement also had a kind of violent backlash against Dalits. So this is the historical backdrop. Looking at the literary context in which Dhasal started writing poems, and was that after 1947, roughly after Second World War, there is a shift in the kind of poetry that was written. And there is an explosion of modernist avant-garde poetry by this poet Basi Mardekar, 1909 to 1956. And you can see the year of his demise being same as the demise of Dr. Ambedkar. And this idiom that he used was an expression of dark despair and a rage of impotency against urbanized space, against industrialized capitalist city called Bombay, and the dehumanization of the routine life that it had. And Mardekar's poems are explicit in their sexual imagery, for which they were banned, and he was charged with obscenity. But what he brought into Marathi poetry was an end of certain kind of romanticism. And this idiom of new poetry, Nava Kavita as it is said, was constituted by translation of language of Euro-American avant-gardes like surrealism, imagism, and so on into the language of modern Marathi poetry. It also questioned the nationalistic romanticism, self-description by translating the dark, degraded world of urban squalor, explicit sexuality and despair, almost of Baudelairean kind, into language of lyrical sentimentality, of the culture of established poetics that had dominated modern Marathi poetry in those times. The Mardekarian avant-garde tradition was continued later on by many major Marathi poets like Arun Kolatkar, Dilip Chitre, and Vasant Dahake. And it is in this space opened up by Mardekar's radical poetics that the little magazine movements began on in an explosive way in Maharashtra. And their poetry, their politics was non-conformist, very often very urban, sexually explicit, politically charged, very often Marxist kind of orientation of periodicals of that time. And it is in these periodicals that Namdeo Dhasal started writing poetry. And these are the groups, these are the groups of writers coming together in the space which Anjali Nerlekar has called Bombay Modern. It's in that space, cosmopolitan space, that Dhasal starts writing poetry. So his poetry, while on one hand is deeply charged by the activism that he participated in, but is also deeply influenced by modernist impulse, a cosmopolitan surreal. So one of the basic problems that many people have in reading Dhasal's poetry is that it's extremely surreal, right? Very often trying to undermine the logical flow of images or ideas by startling images, which often look incompatible. And there is a lot of play, a play of certain subversive nature rather than play as fun. So subversive kind of play that dominates makes his poems not very easy to read for anybody, even in Marathi, let alone in translation. However, at this point, the Dalit intervention was extremely significant. They pointed out that the modernist little magazine movements, as well as Mardekar's movement, or Olatkar and Chitre and Dahake, or other modernist writers, they were also upper caste, the Savarna. They were largely masculinist. Modernist poetry was as modernist and upper caste as the earlier romantic poetry from 19th century onwards. And Dhasal would term this literary culture dominated by the upper caste elites, especially of particular caste, not just upper caste, but particular caste, as 3.5% of population, as 3.5% sahitya. Means the literature produced till Dalit movement was a literature produced by 3.5% of population for 3.5% of population. So there was a need to open up this space, which was dominated by 1 or 2 castes or 3 castes at the most, upper caste. Open up this whole space of literature to democratize it radically. And this democratizing impulse has something to do with the Republican impulse that you find in a lot of other literatures in India after 1950, after the Constitution of India. In this modernist avant-garde idiom that was the predominant mode, Dhasal translated the language of abjects, the world of Kamatipura, Bombaya Hindi, and Urdu, and subverted Sanskrit words to introduce indeterminacy and undermine not just elitism of modern Marathi poetry, but also the elitism of modernist idiom, thus simultaneously continuing and subverting Marathi avant-garde traditions. His influence on later generation of Dalit as well as non-Dalit Marathi poets is immense. Many stylistic aspects of Dhasal's avant-garde, heterogeneous, playful, alliterative, explicit, and opaque rhetoric, and these are the reasons why his poems make it very difficult to understand, finds echoes in linguistic flourishes of significant later poets like Bhujang Meshram, a tribal poet, Arun Kale, a Dalit poet, Mahindra Bhavre, another contemporary Dalit poet, and Santosh Pawar, who is not a Dalit poet, but a lot of other poets from other several locations are influenced by Dhasal. One of the keys to understand this poetics and politics, how they come together in his writing, is to look at what he himself says about his theory and practice of poetry. In an interview given to the noted Marathi writers and activist Satish Kalsekar and Pradnya Lokhande, that is Pawar, for the journal Anushtubha in the special issue on Namdeo Dhasal in 98, later reprinted in 3rd edition of Golpitha, Dhasal discusses his artistic and political vision as follows. My commitment is that I will express whatever contradictions are there in my political act and in my literary act, with all their complexities and agonies. Earlier, the structure of poetry was equal to feelings plus imagination and composition. The academic people used to think like that. Feelings, movement, composition, imagination, plus contradiction between individuals and collectivity, plus the universe, plus action and contradiction between all these things are also important. Poetry is reaching out to 10,000 contradictions in story of what it is called the 10,000 years of old human civilization and the life of a person who carries it. That is how I define poetry. Hence, I'm extremely free with no burden, no convention. From this point of view, I let others say whatever they like about my isms and traditions, but I have this honest opinion about Dalit literature. You should go beyond the narrow concept. The term Dalit is synonym for proletarian, and that's the term he uses over here. What a vast world you can access with this kind of vision. So in his literary theory, or you may say, or which is also his political theory, he wants to open up the idea of Dalit to entire humanity. And this makes his poetry cannot be pinned down to a smaller kind of identity politics that is very often associated with Dalit literature. And he tries to speak on behalf of all the fallen, oppressed, trampled people, not just because of caste system, but all kinds of system. This is a very important idea to be born in your mind when you look at the poems like Mandakini Patil, a young prostitute, and a poem like Hunger. So if you understand what he is trying to say here, you understand what he is trying to do in these poems as well. The contradictions, and that is also what makes his poetry complex and very tricky to pin down, is that the significance of his poetry is made up of these contradictions, all talking to among themselves, creating a kind of resonance and chaos. At the same time, a kind of structures that he produces, of which are a large kind of odes, ode-like structures, very often resembling Neruda's odes. That's what I'm very often reminded of when I read his poems. And Ambedkarism and Marxism are often perceived as ideologically incompatible by many Dalit thinkers who highlight the identity politics of caste and politicians, because the category of caste cannot be reduced to class, and religion like Buddhism is not perceived to be the opium of masses by Ambedkarites. It is this opening up of the concept of Dalit, and as reflected in the manifesto of Dalit Panther, is what is found in Dhasal's own poetics. So this allows him to access resources which are human, of entire human civilization, rather than a particular caste and its identity politics. And that's what makes his poems, I don't know how to put it, have some sort of universality which cannot be pinned down only to a caste specific identitarian movement. His poetry becomes a searing criticism, obviously devoid of predisposition to glorify or romanticize the history of Indian culture, which characterizes the Savarna view of it. Namdeo's blistering revision and interrogation of ancient civilization of Indian subcontinent, called nation these days, which is also to use his own image, the organized harem of the octopus. Octopus cha sangatit janan khana. That's how he calls it. From below and from the margins is a powerful dimension of his poetic vision. As a poet, this openness and inclusiveness allows him to access creative cultural resources from international avant-garde movements, the resource of established Marathi poetry, and the resources available to a Marathi Dalit poet. And this is where you should also keep in mind that most of the so-called folk traditions are the traditions of performance, which are largely upheld by people who are from lower castes. So what is called folk in India is not what you call folk in the West. It's not equivalent category. But so he would have, a Dalit poet would have an access to these resources, given the kind of cultural location that he came from. And this radical openness is reflected in range of incompatible and contradictory linguistic registers, often ranging from highly Sanskritized lexis. And this is also something which makes his poems very interesting, that he uses very often tatsam words from spirituality and Sanskrit in order to subvert them, in order to mock them or critique them, and mixes up with Kamathipura slang and from oral and performative devices to Western avant-garde techniques of surrealism. From mythology in Bath sense of the words of sewage water, sex workers, venereal diseases, to the sublime terms and ideas from Buddhist philosophy. From the rhetoric of political speeches to the registers of tenderness and erotic love. From Bombaya Hindi to English or Urdu. From references to Bollywood to evocation of myths and legends from ancient civilization. From registers of bhakti to contemporary Western avant-garde visual art, and from mythology of Marxism to eulogies on Ambedkar, from odes to Gandu Bagicha, that is the art Pucker's Park, and Saint Falkland Road. Falkland Road is the red light area in Bombay, to a lofty ode to Indira Gandhi in a biblical kind of manner. So you can see this kind of mixture of divergent stylistic and diverse kind of linguistic registers make his poems extremely complex to decipher. And this is what separates him from other Dalit poets, is his radically innovative use of this range and diversity of semiotic registers and resources, which make Dalit poets, which other Dalit poets have not been able to do as successfully as Dhasal. Such a complex use of what Chitre calls bastard language makes his poetry complex and barely accessible to either an average Dalit listener or to highly literate reader. And in his introduction to Golpitha, Vijay Tendulkar, very famous Marathi playwright, talks about his inability to understand this language. And so he talks about when Namdeo Dhasal came to his room and asked him to visit Kamatipura and Golpitha and Gandu Bagicha to see these areas. And it showed him the life there and the language that was used. So that is a very important aspect, that even the highly elite class nor the Dalit class are able to easily unpack or decode his language. The surrealistic imagery and flow of his poems and his sudden but deliberate extension or orchestration of different contexts of experience baffles both the initiated and literate among the audience. The implied reader in Dalit's text, Dhasal's text, is like someone like Dhasal himself, who is intimate not only with local language variety, but also Indian and global artistic and political movements. This makes his text obscure and opaque for many of his readers. And it's also possible to see his text as produced by the asymmetry and heterogeneity and boundaries of the urban Marathi cultural space, which is dominated by the upper caste, upper middle class, white collared, something called Pandar Pesha in Marathi cultural space, that have traditionally occupied the core of Marathi culture, and relegating the spaces like Dhorchal and Kamathipura to the boundaries and borders of Marathi culture. So the spaces that were almost excluded and marginalized from Marathi definitions of culture are brought back to the center with Dhasal. That is something very important here. So in order to understand a poem like Mandakini Patil, an intended collage, you have to understand here, what does Kamathipura actually mean? And that is the space from which he is writing this poem. So Kamathi originally means construction workers, and in central Mumbai, it's one of the largest red light areas on the subcontinent, entire. It is one lane away from Dhorchal, where Namdeo Dhasal grew up. Near the first lane of Kamathipura, on what is called Duncan Road, is Durga Devi Park, Udyan, and it is called Hijra Gali. So there is a name given by official state, Durga Devi Park, but it is called Hijra Gali due to obvious reasons. That is the place where people, the sex workers, especially eunuchs and hijras, offer their services. So, and people therefore, for obvious reason, call it Gandu Bagicha, that is arts focused park, indicating sodomy and homosexuality that that particular area refers to. As Rishi Muchumdar puts it, the Hijra community near Durga Devi Udyan, also called Gandu Bagicha, used to carry out esoteric rituals, including those of nirvana or emasculation in the park. And in many of Dhasal's work, there are references to these ritual practices of Hijras, which is nirvana. And interestingly, nirvana is also a term used in Buddhist philosophy for ultimate liberation, and for a neo-Buddhist like Dhasal, this whole association of nirvana with, I think, castration or emasculation ritual that the Hijras carry out must be a strange kind of experience. The park was then renovated and attempts were made to sanitize it. However, it is still called Gandu Bagicha for the people. While the narrator in the poem called Ranki Punav in Golpitha, describing the dance of eunuchs in the festival of what is called Ranki Punav, is more of an objective watcher. Gandu Bagicha, and that's the name of his poem, and collection of a poem, becomes a full-fledged metaphor of subversive and abject counter space in Dhasal's collection Gandu Bagicha in 1986. So these are some of the cultural, and this is some of the lines of Gandu Bagicha, and that will help you to decode the poems that you're looking at. This is how it goes, and I'm just quoting these lines to give you a sense of the heterogeneity and plurality of linguistic register. It goes something like this: Gandu Bagicha Don. It is no longer the garden we knew. Mere dost, jara bhun ke de mera fata hua hriday. The worm of Karmanyavadika Raste has started nibbling at the silence. The crippled cockroach of Karma Yoga needlessly keeps digging up the soil. It has already torn the condoms of delusion to tatters. That's how the language goes. So you can see the phrases like Karmanyavadika Raste and Karma Yoga, and also the images like crippled cockroach, and a Hindi phrase like Mere dost jara bhunke de mera fata hua hriday. So you can see the kind of language, diversity of language within the heteroglossic language, to use Bakhtin's phrase in Marathi. So there are words that come from Sanskrit, Bombaya, or Hindi, or Urdu and English, and even extremely competent translators like Chitre, probably due to non-native location of translator. The English translation of Dhasal poetry fails to capture the juxtaposition of such semiotic diversity, as Lotman would call it, heterogeneity, which produces new kinds of semantic resonance here. The poem begins with narrator's nostalgia when the homosexual and transgender Hijra sex workers would freely offer their service to customers. Digging up the soil, euphemistically in Marathi, connotes homosexual act. The attempts to sanitize Gandu Bagicha have become emasculated because of the space, according to the narrator himself. And the process of sanitization is actually the process of Sanskritization, which is, according to the heartbroken narrator, speaker, is the process of emasculation and repression of a culture to which Dhasal belongs, and probably culture in general. The metaphors like worm of Karmanyavadika Raste and the crippled cockroach of Karma Yoga also suggest how it is actually the Brahmanism that has buggered or screwed up or made an asshole of the culture, as the term Gandu implies. So these are the kind of linguistic and cultural codes at the back of his poems, which makes it impossible for a translator to translate them very often, and for a person who is studying his poems to understand it. So apart from heterogeneous polyglotticism of his avant-garde style, Namdeo Dhasal's poetry is characterized by rich and thematic range, as the poem that you are looking at indicates. That is Mandakini Patil, Mala Abhipret collage. And the very idea of collage indicates fragmentation and a kind of avant-garde style of depicting the fragments, which cannot be put together. And this fragmentation happens in the narrator's memory of this young woman called Mandakini Patil, who is a 16-year-old probably girl, who is confined to Kamathipura sex work. And what she experiences is the theme of the poem of everyday fragmentation of life that happens. And it's painful, agonizing, and traumatic. And the images of a pig whose snot is blooded, and the images of sodomy. And in the poem, the narrator also speaks about how the possibility of warmth and love associated with the other kind of sexual acts, the normative or maybe elite or the privileged entitled sexual acts, is very different over here. It is a brutal, dehumanizing experience, and for this 16-year-old girl. And Dhasal used the term Shodasha in Marathi. Shodasha means somebody who is 16-year-old, and that's a very Sanskrit phrase. So his poetry overflows with the images of sewage and venereal diseases and Sanskrit vocabulary, creating a kind of concoction which is very difficult to decode. And the poem Mandakini Patil Mala Abhipret Aslila Collage is also in a kind of ode-like fashion, very similar to the poem Hunger that you are studying. The Hunger is more of conventional left poem, which talks about the whole question of hunger as a political reality rather than just being merely a physical reality, and a war on hunger. However, the poems like Mandakini Patil are too complex to decode. And in English, I think Chitre has done a fantastic job in trying to bring out things which are even ambivalent in the original. So the translation has happened in some way explicating some of the ambivalent areas in the poem, bringing more clarity. So translation is a kind of explanation of a poem which does not offer any explanation in Marathi. So that also indicates the range of Dhasal's work. So erotic poetry is also another very important genre that he seems to use, especially in his poetry collection called Khed, which is about sexual love. But it is never far away from the experience of caste victimization and oppression, and coming from a marginalized space. The agony of that coexist with erotic play between man and woman that is celebrated using a lot of imagery from Bible and whatnot. So that is the entire collection called Khed, that is game or play that Dhasal talks about. He wrote one ode-like poem addressed to Dr. Ambedkar every year on Dr. Ambedkar's birth centenary, and that would become part of all his collection. And then they were collected and brought out in a single volume called Tuze Bot Dharun Challo Ahe Mi. That means I am walking, holding your finger, in 2006. But in 2007, 1976, he wrote an ode titled Amcha Itihasatil Ek Apariharya Patra Priyadarshani. That is, Priyadarshani, an inevitable character in our history, addressed to the then Prime Minister Indira Gandhi. For many of his leftist admirers, critics, and supporters, this was an act of sycophancy and opportunism, as Mrs. Gandhi had withdrawn all the cases against Dalit Panthers after the Worli riots that we mentioned. And he had a meeting with her, and he was extremely impressed by her personality. The poem like this is uncharacteristic of Dalit literature and demonstrate unpredictability of Dhasal, the politician and the poet. Attacking all the opponents of Mrs. Gandhi as fascists and the enemies of humanity and womanhood, the poem celebrates the mythology of Mrs. Gandhi as Durga, created by the likes of M.F. Hussain, and compares her to Goan of Arc. The speaker in the poem, Priyadarshani, keenly aware of impending criticism of his poem, tells Mrs. Gandhi to keep smiling like a new green leaf in humble part of our hearts. So the personality and politics of Namdeo Dhasal is extremely complex and controversial, and very often, but what is not controversial is his status as a poet. There is, in fact, his status as a poet has made him one of the most, probably the huge following that he had as a politician had something to do with his greatness as a poet. People were hypnotized by his poetry. While it is easy to critique the politics and ideology of Dhasal, and I think it's 6, so I will try to wind up. The poem has to be understood in its historical context. The poem was written during the tense period of Indian emergency imposed by Gandhi, and Dhasal is trying to be a spokesperson not of an electoral political party or the elite left, but large section of Indian society who undeniably admired Mrs. Gandhi even after her death. In attempt to avoid the elitist view of Indian history and culture, a view taken not just by the cultural nationalists, but also the socialist and the left, Dhasal always sought a position alongside the masses and tries to look at the politics from their perspective. And this long poem, unlike his poems, lacks creative complexity and richness. Apart from these, you also have a collection of his poems dedicated to women like Mandakini Patil. And that also has become a separate collection called Janki Devi and Itar Kavita, which is his collection of poems about women. So gender, sexuality, eroticism is another very important thematic preoccupation in Dhasal. His collection, Care, that I just mentioned, is dedicated to all erotic activities of men and women. These philosophical poems, in his characteristic heterogeneous, surreal, dense style and ode-like features, celebrate the joys and suffering of erotic love with all its contradictions. And the term contradiction is very important, the term that we just saw in his interview. So how do you understand Dhasal, who teams up with Indira Gandhi as well as with Shiv Sena? Is a contradiction, and he was a person who would welcome contradictions of all kinds rather than simply situating yourself on the one side of binary all the time. And that kind of thing is also found in his poems. So poems are not obviously romantic in the conventional sense, as eroticism and man-woman relationship is seen through the eyes of oppressed, deprived, and stigmatized man, who is politically aware of multiple inequalities, contradictions, and historical ironies. So this is what I had to say about Mandakini Patil, which I have already discussed, so I'm not repeating it. The poem is in Marathi is titled Mandakini Patil Mala Abhipret Aslela Kolaj. Chitre has added something to the title, said to a young prostitute. So you can see how translation acts as a way of explanation, elaboration, clarification for a different readership. And the English translations can be helpful to understand even the complexity of Marathi poems. Is something that, so one of the questions that I often ask myself is, how do you read something like this in English translation? Because English as a language has been extremely restrictive in terms of registers and context, and tends to be homogenizing, while this kind of extremely plural language, which is locally rooted in some part of marginalized geographies of culture, how does it negotiate that? Something which is elite, English itself, inherently language of elite and privilege. How does it do justice to this? Is a question that I always ask myself, and I don't have any easy answer to that. Okay, so that is what I had to say. I would be very happy to respond to questions, or if there is something else that you want me to clarify or throw some light on. So if it is possible for me, then I would be very happy to do that.
Thank you, sir,
Yeah.
Thank you, sir, for such a compelling session on situating Namdeo Dhasal. We would now like to invite the audience to ask their questions. You can write your questions in the chat box or unmute yourselves.
Any questions, girls? Dr. Ketkar, I had a question.
Yeah.
This is just an observation. Maybe you can help me clarify my confusion or whatever, my thesis. This is in connection with Dhasal's wife's memoir, where she writes a glorifying and yet a very damning kind of creates a very damning picture of Namdeo Dhasal, where she talks about the fact that though his politics, as far as his poetry is concerned, or his public life is concerned, is commendable, but when it came to his personal life, he himself was quite violent, with her. That's number one. And what was the response of Dalit women writers to Dhasal's work? So I'm interested in finding out. So
Dalit writers' response to Dhasal's poem?
Poetry, poetry. Representation of women, Marathi Dalit women writers, how did they respond to his poetry?
Actually, if you ask me, Dalit feminism as a discourse is fairly recent, means it's only in past decade or two that it is slowly emerging in Marathi. But it has not become a critique as a kind of analytical critique of existing Dalit poetry. So you would hardly find a Dalit feminist critique of Dhasal's poems, though Dalit feminism positions itself against masculinism and patriarchy within Dalit movement. And the additional complexity to the situation is brought about by the fact that Malika Amar Sheikh, his wife, is not a Dalit. So she comes from a father who is a Muslim and mother who is a Brahmin, and her father was equally famous poet, Shahir Amar Sheikh. So how do Dalit women look at Malika Amar Sheikh is a very different question, which is not put out there in public till today. But Dalit feminism is critical of patriarchy functioning within the Dalit movement itself. And I had personally just heard writers like Urmila Pawar and Pradnya Pawar say that the Dalit leaders would say that why do you need to have feminism? Because we, the lower caste people, women are not oppressed. Only the upper caste women are oppressed. And so that triggered them to take up this different kind of critique. So I find it coming up only in the later part. The question of gender in post-independence Dalit thinking comes up, I think, with 1989, where the Dalit women associated with Ambedkar put together their voices. And it's there in the part of the book called We Also Made History. And later on, Dalit feminism takes on after 90s, means after Gopal Guru and Sharmila Rege's discussion of the topic. So you find very little textual critique of Dalit tradition. Most of it is in the way of saying that we have to experience this double oppression, not just as Dalit, but also as women. And even within Dalit movement, women are considered, they are taken for granted, because Dalit thinkers would say feminism is required for upper caste women because they are oppressed. Aplyala kai garaj hai? We are not oppressed, right? So these are some of the things that are being discussed, but a kind of revision of Dalit movement from within by Dalit feminism, I have not come across that till date. But at oral, means discussional level, I sense that. And his collection called Janki Devi talks about his representation of women is not, does not become so violent or violating or through male gaze, because he's constantly aware of dehumanization of the prostitutes that he's sex workers he's writing about, and the caste dimensions of it, because only women from a lower caste will come to this, will be pushed into this profession most of the time. So his poetry has this side of compassion, empathy, tenderness, and I didn't find misogyny in means it would be, I would require to maybe analyze the whole collection of his poems, which has gleaning of his poems on women called Janki Devi. It's not a new collection, it's already existing poems he has selected. So but again, the term Janki Devi talks about, means goddess of rags. So the question of poverty and caste oppression, he never sees women as separate from it.
Right. Yeah.
I don't know if I have answered, because
no, you have.
Because
I was just
that
curious.
Kind of analysis, analysis is not. I haven't seen such analysis come up.
Sanjukta, Dr. Naskar wants to ask a question.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, thank you so much. I can't unmute the video. Anyhow, so thank you so much, Professor Ketkar. Really wonderful. Actually, I have a very general question, because whenever we talk about Dalit literature, a lot of it, as we are all aware of, is in the regional languages. Everybody writes in their mother tongue. So, I mean, and you've been a translator yourself. So do you think somewhere the power and the energy of expression, the fact that people are talking about their personal experiences, or at least some kind of memory which they've been part of, or at least handed down, do you think some of it is lost? Because I don't know, I mean, you've done some translations, but the language, I guess, gets dissipated somewhere. Do you have anything to say?
See, this does not happen only in case of Dalit literature, right? If you compare any language, any literature from any language with its translation, you sense a kind of what is missing and lost very often from the original in the translated version. Means if you translate, say, for example, beloved into Marathi, then you will also find that there is things that are not captured. But instead of looking at translation as an question of coming up with identical registers or phrases, I see it more as an interpretation. So translation as interpretation of the source text is possible. You cannot create the same text in another language. And that applies to almost every kind of literature, not just Dalit. And in case of Dalit, it becomes all the more difficult, because even the so-called mother tongue is not a kind of homogeneous given. It's the dialect or a slang or a marginal variety of language. So it has to be translated as the introduction to Golpita by Vijay Tendulkar puts it. He says that I was unable to understand the Marathi of this poem. He is a Marathi writer who is unable to understand Marathi of Dhasal. So he went around Kamathipura with Dhasal and he showed him all the things that are mentioned in the poem. So even in Marathi, you require a translation in the so-called standard or the elite part of it. So it becomes all the more difficult in the case of Dalit, but I would still see translation as an interpretative act rather than an act to come up with exact equivalence. So how does it read on its own? For me is an important question. Then how does it read in comparison to the source text? That is how I look at it. Loss and gain is, I think, because there are no equivalents anywhere, even in the source language, you need translation. So translation, this lack of equivalence and identity is the condition for translation, without which translation cannot happen. So I am interested in what does Dalit literature do to English language, rather than seeing whether this is captured or not. Obviously, it won't be. That's how I perceive the whole situation. And as I said in the discussion of Mandakini Patil, Chitre clarifies some of the things which are not, they are just there in Marathi poems. So in spite of being a Marathi speaker, I find it useful to read the translation and go back to the original, that kind of as a gloss, as an explanatory gloss to the original.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ketkar, for this absolutely brilliant lecture. You made the entire context come alive for us and very useful for our students. And now I'm going to welcome Sejal to do the vote of thanks.
Thank you, ma'am. Respected teachers, Dr. Sachin Ketkar, and all the students present here, it is my privilege to give the vote of thanks and conclude this session. On behalf of the English department, thank you, Dr. Ketkar, for taking out time from your busy schedule and conducting this informative session. We thank everyone.
My honor and pleasure is all
Thank
mine.
you, sir.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you, sir. We thank everyone for joining this session today. Thank you and have a great day.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Ketkar. I'll be in touch.
Thank you, Dr.
Thank you. Thank you so much.